So let me just introduce Jeremy, who I've known, I think it's probably most of this century. Jeremy's an accomplished green building professional, passionate about sustainable energy and water systems, the circular economy, and I thought this was cute, organizations with a heart. He spent more than a decade at USGBC. I don't know if that's in dog years or not, but I guess it would be 30 dog years, or 70 dog years, running public policy. He was the guy, the state and local guy, and there's 50 states. So he's a busy man. And he now runs PlanetSigmon, advising resilient cities and sustainable businesses. He's been part of the Ember strategies team, Face It and Figure It Out, integrated sustainable content for Salesforce work from home guidebook, which is a pretty amazing document and something that we probably try to put links up to, and is co-developing a solution for I guess employee management called homequarters. And that is for companies trying to manage, the fact that they have a lot of employees coming in and some working from home and, trying to get into this next new normal. So take it away, Jeremy.
Well, it's a pleasure, Dennis. And I think it'll be a bit of a back and forth here on a conversation, I think was our intended approach. But I thought it was entertaining when you asked me to come and speak to Sustainable Silicon Valley this evening or this afternoon on a topic called Back to Buildings. And I think it's actually quite funny because many of us have spent almost the last year inside many of our buildings. And so in some ways, back to buildings is almost a misnomer. It's like, back to which buildings are we talking about anyway? And so thank you for the introduction, by the way. It's great to be here. Actually, some of the things that I was hoping to talk about have already been mentioned a little bit this afternoon, which is great, because nothing helps a point set in like reinforcement. I thought I might share my screen on a couple of things, and we could fold that into a dialogue as we go. But firstly, I just wanted to share a little bit more, as I mentioned, about myself. I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about buildings. Started out in solar energy, thinking about how our energy systems could be better integrated with our buildings, and how our buildings could just be ultimately more intelligent. There's me with my friend Bob during the pandemic, putting up a solar electric system for him in obviously cold country. And I also have really developed quite a passion for water systems, and in particular in our buildings. And a lot of that came from working with cities and the state government, in particular in California, and also in collaboration with Dennis on things in relation to the 2014 through 2017 drought. And now we're back in one. And actually that time period that we like to call the wet century, 20th century, when we decided to design all of our policy, might be the exception rather than the rule. So we have a lot to think about in the West and in California in particular around water management, and our buildings are an important piece of it. And then, as Dennis mentioned, I spent a lot of time thinking about buildings and green buildings in particular. And these days, I'm actually helping a company get started here in the United States that's focused on zero energy buildings called Utopia. So it's actually quite a few things that I've spent my time on. And this past year, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with Ember Strategies and a lot of really smart people in this group that we decided to call Team Face It and Figure It Out. And it actually introduced me to a lot of scientists. And I spent a year in Oxford prior to, I guess, this pandemic year, really. And talking to scientists and academics all day long can get pretty exhausting, as you might imagine. But one thing it helps to teach you is the concept of needing evidence to before you sort of jump to conclusions, right? There's that classic jump to conclusions hopscotch in the movie Office Space, and we are often so quick to do so, especially when the world is changing underneath our feet. Um, and I think 2020 and into 2021 has actually created a really useful microcosm to see just how quickly we tend to gravitate towards or grasp at the next possible solution, and we often forget some of the basics that we already knew about. So yeah, I think that's the sort of the setup for a little dialogue that Dennis, I think you and I would like to have. I've got a handful of visuals to go alongside. Um, but yeah, I think I'll kick it back to you to see where you'd like to take our conversation next.
Well, the back to buildings issue, it's back to different buildings. Obviously, a lot of people have been in their own homes and home offices, and at least in this area, say the Bay Area, the vaccination rates are getting pretty high. I'm sure there's there's definitely a few people avoiding it for various reasons, but the numbers are quite high. I think Santa Clara just went yellow. San Mateo County, San Francisco's yellow. So there are, well, I mean, a lot of the things that you've been working on just in various guises is about going back to buildings, and you're wondering about different aspects of that, the HVAC systems, how the office layouts. There was the great migration to open office, and then also now I guess you're working on with home quarters. You're working in terms of essentially hybrid strategies with which get to become pretty complex for employers. So I guess the first thing would be if you wanted to make comments about just even that view of getting back to office buildings.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, and one that actually I should mention. I have a background up here. Some of you might recognize it. It's Trafalgar Square in London, which is basically my last memory pre-pandemic. I was over there, and I don't know if you can see over my shoulder here, but there's lots of people. There's big buildings that people are flowing in and out of, and it just feels like eons ago, even though it was just a little over a year ago. And one of the things that I started working on in the pandemic time, thinking about buildings and how we use them and how we started using them differently, was actually thinking about the fact that if we under occupy buildings, we shut the water off, or we may not shut it off, but it starts not being used. And what does that do for our buildings, and how do we think about health and efficiency and reliability and all those kinds of things in buildings that are effectively unoccupied? We talk a lot about energy, and maybe we can save a whole lot of energy if we're not in our buildings. We should certainly be able to save some water too. But the thought that water not flowing in plumbing systems, it actually terrifies plumbing engineers and public health officials. And so I've actually been working with the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, IAPMO, and the American Water Works Association on a standard to help guide building owners for the next moment where they might have partial building occupancy or building shutdown, because stagnant water, maybe in the pipe that's coming out of Bart Simpson's mouth here, that's called a dead end. Stagnant water in a pipe like that one basically is a breeding ground for all kinds of bacteria. We often say that water is life, but it's also life to bacteria, and water that isn't flowing quickly consumes the chemicals that we've added to it gently, hopefully, to keep us safe. So it's just an interesting one. I don't think it got as much attention as many other topics, and one where I hope that we're going to be able to make some progress. And actually, before anybody criticizes me for saying that we actually need to get all our buildings with water flowing constantly, I of course would acknowledge that typically in most places, and I believe in California as well, we share water between buildings and agriculture by about 20% and 80%, right? So 80% is consumed by agriculture, 20% by buildings. We certainly have a lot of opportunity to make a whole lot of savings, but we do have quite a finite resource to share, and in particular in California.
Yes, Felicia Marcus will be commenting on that, just that kind of thing in a little while.
Good.
But yeah, no, there is I mean, anyone that in an office has probably cursed out at some point, has cursed out the facilities staff because, it's too cold or it's too hot, and, balancing those issues. And that's just, say, the HVAC side. The water side is, as you mentioned, is pretty daunting as far as shutting things down and starting that back up. And also, there was a number of organizations, I'm thinking, just even some of the big corporates like, well, Salesforce and Facebook were doing, basically shut down they had really showcase water reuse systems, but they didn't have the capacity in the buildings to really run them. And, basically mothballing those
Hmm.
is a very daunting task as well. So there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that is uh, not inconsiderable.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to jump over a couple of things here, and go back to one concept where most of us have been at home in some way, shape, or form. Those of us, I guess, who've been either privileged enough to be at home or unfortunate enough to be at home. I think there's a whole spectrum there. And most of us, no matter how big your apartment or your house is, probably felt like it was too small. We all wish that we had a better view or better outdoor space, but outdoor space is not always the perfect solution for a quiet environment for doing a Zoom call, or the space that you need potentially to house relatives or others. So that there's a whole new way of thinking about our buildings, I think, in the pandemic and now coming out of hopefully the back end of it, where we're really thinking about how to reinvent the office and how we might reinvent the home. Dennis, you mentioned this concept of sort of this hybrid work environment that I've been talking to some friends and colleagues about, where we're pretty eager to try to help companies navigate a new environment where, yes, many companies have had remote employees for quite some time now, but they were always, well, for most companies anyway, they were a fraction of the workforce. Whereas now, for companies that have been used to having employees in the office, many of them are going to expect them only a couple of days a week at most, and many will be remote for most of the time. So how does that change the company? How does that change the company culture? How does it change the dynamic of where you calculate things that I care about, we care about? Sustainability, where is your footprint anymore? Is your footprint just in your office building, or is it the extension of all your home offices that are part of that network? I think it's an interesting question, and I think companies will begin to think about that differently. Um, and at the same time, you have the same problem that's going on at home, as you have a new series of uses for your home office space. So that sustainability at home guide, which we'll provide a link to through the follow-up, I'm sure, I think was a nice attempt. I worked on it with Salesforce and Ember strategies as well, to see what we can grab hold of as office workers from home. Some of us who maybe didn't do that before. And I did want to just tip a nod to some of the work that my friends have done with Ember strategies, on just thinking really carefully about what it means to manage an office building, which we will need to do when we start putting people back in them, which is now. Um, and just adding more air doesn't always solve the problem, right? Because you can have people that are downstream of bad air. So it's really about getting the bad air out and not necessarily about getting the good air in to certain places. It's about space design. There's a lot of fluid dynamics. It's really complicated. But I think there's also just some simple truths, which is about, people using good judgment, respecting local rules, whether it's the building management, the city, the state government, what have you. And then I think it's also just a common respect for the fact that, we recognize that we got into this mess. You can point fingers however you like, but the mess happened. And I think the only real way out of it is communally. So to think about community actions and how best we can put not just ourselves, but the community forward.
So back to buildings better,
Yeah, exactly.
to jump on a slogan. We are in that period of, I'll say the Q&A period. And so, I mean, I did want to make sure that there was a question about fire hardening buildings and converting them. Well, I guess a couple different things here. Fire hardening buildings and converting them to be more energy efficient and sustainable. Now, traditionally, a lot of fire hardening has made buildings less sustainable. I'm thinking of, the foam insulation and stuff. But anyway, how do you have a take on those kind of questions as we're talking about back to buildings better?
Yeah, I can't claim to be a perfect expert on fire safety and its nexus with efficiency, but I will say um, that the concept of fire, I mean, I think everybody on this call knows it, is not going away anytime soon. And the concept of bringing fire hardening into our buildings, I think, is part of the future, right? Um, and some of the research that I've read actually diagnoses that much of the problem has actually been about embers that have found their way into attic spaces by being drafted in. And those attic spaces then being a good box of kindling. Um, and a much more insulated attic that's actually closed off and effectively using a warm roof it is unvented. And so it's one strategy, but there are many strategies that, according to some of the research, I don't claim that it's all of it, could actually be a very useful strategy. I think at the same time, we recognize that from a fire hardening perspective, the move to all electric helps us with the concept of removing some of the combustibles from our home. One of the speakers earlier was talking about, or I think it was a video, talking about getting indoors where the air quality is better, but we often then start combusting indoors when we use natural gas, which then downgrades our air quality, even when the outdoor air quality is pristine. So I think there's a confluence of quite a few issues that you can't take one of them and expect to solve all the problems. You have to solve them as a solution set.
Certainly true. And um, just one other kind of question that came up or has come up. We've been talking about, I think, office, although a little bit of residential. And I just wondered in the work you've been doing, if obviously now schools are coming into play, and
Mhm.
and ventilation in school classrooms is been pretty dicey, has a dicey history, especially in terms of those package units or the mobile, not mobile units, but you know what I mean, the modular units with their weird, um, well, their HVAC systems clamped on. Um, I just wondered if you had any thoughts in that particular area for people listening in that have are thinking about kids in schools.
Yeah, I thought you might ask about that. I think it's first and foremost important to acknowledge that I think parents of with children of any age have probably just deserve a Medal of Honor this past year, whether it was managing kids at home or managing the reality that their kids of many ages were lacking the experiences that they probably ought to have had. So I think getting back to classrooms of some kind is really key to the reopening of the economy and of our future. I think for some, it's going to be really difficult to imagine being in some of these dense places or putting their kids in some of these dense spaces. Um, and that ventilation probably has always been an issue. I used to be a member of one of the staff of this National Center for Green Schools, and we often talked about air quality as well as acoustics, actually, to keep the space comfortable, not only for students but for teachers, not having to raise their voices all day and having to take sick days because they're running out of voice left in pretty noisy spaces. So there's a lot of different issues that come as a confluence in school buildings. I think as schools have been reopening, I don't have kids of my own, so I can't speak from my own experience. But I can say from what I've been reading and from following the families that I'm in touch with, it's a series of tough decisions, I think, about how to feel safe and to operate and to do what's best with for your kids and their education and their health. Most schools don't have a quick and easy fix for air quality. Most schools don't have a quick and easy fix for energy efficiency or sustainability. Most of our buildings need a long-term care and a management plan that thinks clearly about how to make the next investment about health and wellness, and also about environmental sustainability and education at the same time. So I tend to think a bit about folding this new frame that we have about expecting a whole lot more of our buildings into the planning process. And I tend not to, I tend to take a grain of salt, a pinch of salt when I hear all kinds of air quality, like quick fixes, like destroying molecules and blasting dust and all kinds of things. Who knows? I mean, when we started into this pandemic, we added a whole lot of extra chemicals in many places because we wanted to be extra clean, but now we've actually toxified the air. And so I think there's a lot of extremes that can be taken. And I think the most important thing is to think about it clear-headedly. Which, Dennis, I think if we're near the end of the time, I thought I would just share a few, or are we?
Yes, we are getting, we're a couple minutes away. We're going to start talking about chocolate
Yes.
at 4:35.
Oh, good.
And
but what I wanted to sort of end on, and I just breezed over some cartoons. I should probably go back to those because they're amazing. But I'll come back to them in a second. I think just some takeaways when I thought about what you asked me to talk about today. It's very hard to be precise about the right thing to do in any particular building. But I think one thing that's been so true is that I think we need to be nice. There's guidance that's coming out from all kinds of directions. Most of it is well-intentioned, even if history has proven that some of it has been inaccurate because we didn't know at the time. But I think being nice to each other, because none of us really knows. I think not all scientists and academics have the perfect solution either, because I think they tend to hold back until there's an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. And I think that we can use our good judgment, follow our own compass effectively, and try to do what we think is comfortable and safe, but at the same time be respectful of others. Our families and the people that our bubbles will probably connect in with. And I think the main message I have about getting back to buildings is that I think we should all have much higher expectations on what they should do for us, that they should provide comfort and efficiency and health and wellness. I actually just joined a committee by the International Well Building Institute on what healthy single-family housing could look like in the future. There are currently no standards for that, and I think there's there's a strong need in this current climate to come up with some targets and some baselines and try to start measuring off of that. But since we're switching, I just had to show a couple of cartoons. You can find more of them at this link. But part of our exercise over the last year was to try to just make sense of this mess of a pandemic in thinking about building management. And there's a whole lot more where this started, but the project really was an entertaining way to think critically about the issues and also make light of it, because a lot of it was pretty dark, as you know. But I'll leave you with a few cartoons and a link to go find more. And I hope that we do get back to buildings and the buildings that we want to be in.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Yes, it's certainly the green building view and the green schools, standards and practices have aged well, and I think yeah, we have to think in terms of kind of what we don't know can hurt us. So it's we need to expect more. Well, thanks for staying up late on the East Coast, and
my pleasure. And I don't want to keep anybody from their chocolate.
Well, yes, we will switch over to Nate Saul and Coco Terra momentarily. But I wanted to thank you for agreeing to come on and give an update on some of these issues, because things are going to change.
That's right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm excited about Sustainapalooza digital version 1.